I don't think they were within 20 points from us. I think we pretty much killed them. We're live, and everybody loves Kentucky. That was the quietest crowd ever. Sunday mornings are better than that. Turn with me to 95. 95. Let's do the first and fourth verse of Revive Us Again. 95. We praise thee, O God, for the Son of thy love, for Jesus who died and is now gone above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. Revive us again. Fill each heart with thy love. May each soul be rekindled with fire from above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. Turn to 359. 359. Let's do the first, second, and fifth verse. 359. There's within my heart a melody, Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee, peace be still, in all love's life ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. All my life was wrecked by sin and strife, discord filled my heart with pain. Jesus wept across the broken strings, stirred the slumbering chords again. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon he's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall wing my flight to worlds unknown, I shall ring with him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Turn to 556. 556. Let's sing the first and second verse. 556. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, then it all shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. On that bright and cloudless morning, when the dead in Christ shall rise, and the glory of his resurrection share, when his chosen ones shall gather to their home beyond the skies, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there.
Thank you, Greg. I have to have a little water, and I've got lozenges, and Mona's not here because she's sick. Yeah. You cannot say I don't share. Had the flu. I'm over that now. I've got a little bronchitis. Technically, laryngeal tracheal bronchitis. You don't want to hear all that. It's good to be here, though. Sunday, I'd like to have been anywhere but where I was. It was pretty uncomfortable. Everybody got your list out here tonight. Glad to see people out tonight. It's cold and rainy and nasty. And imagine that. It might happen in February. In the hospital at JCMC, we have Johnny Elliott. Any additions to that? Any other folks?
That is Judy Elliott's son. I don't know if everybody knows that or not. He's got pancreatitis and he's having a rough time. He just got out of the hospital from Sycamore Shoals Thursday. And now he's back at the medicine and that. So,
Pancreatitis is no fun.
no.
I had it twice. They finally figured out it was a little tiny gallstone blocking everything up. They got the gallbladder out. So far, it's worked pretty well, but that's no fun. I don't envy him at all. The rehab is Bob Holcomb and George Williams. George is in Clinton. Bob's in Bristol. Any? So he's actually in the waters, okay. At Bluntville, okay. Yeah, he needs those prayers. They call well. When you call those folks in, that just means that comfort care. Well, it means it's a terminal circumstance. You just don't know when, and that could be weeks or months actually. But that's good because they actually can treat things and do things better with physician direction much more easily than it would be otherwise. So it's not necessarily a bad situation. Special request, search for the minister and our youth minister, Eugene and Debbie Davis, Mark and Tina Miller, James Vines and Ian Harden. Any updates or adjustments? Okay. Hope they don't. I hope they don't swap around. That's tough. Well, right now, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Alabama have extreme numbers of flu. They're at the top of the list. And Southwest Virginia is high. The rest of Virginia is not quite as high. It's the next level down. But Southwest Virginia, which is just up the road here, has got extreme levels. So we're right in the belt of all that going on. Expectant moms, Cheyenne Baker, Malin McLean, Mariah McLean, Mom and Baby Brown. Any updates on those folks? I understand if the rumor is correct, I heard Mariah's got twins. That'll teach them.
She prayed for one and the Lord gave her two.
Well, that's all right. She's a poor skinny little girl. I hope she does all right. All right. Nursing home, Life Care, Helen Height, Sycamore Springs, Lulabelle Street, Marilyn Taylor, Bill Roberts, Hermitage, Linda Chambers, Betty Jo Montgomery, Raymond Crabtree, Margaret Fields, Lake Bridge, Gene Campbell, Mountain City, Gene Buchanan, Kyle Bradley, Mike Dellinger, The Waters, Evelyn Collins, Margaret Crow, Signature, Barbara Hicks, Tammy Wells, Ivy Hall, Opal Baird, Brenda Stout, Betty James, Sally Whitehead, Betty Chambers, Shirley Irick, Jack Howell, and Buck Gentry. Hillview, Wanda Laws, and Jack Garrison. Any updates on these? Any additions or people moved around we're aware of? Okay, out of the area, Amy for Africa, Terry Cates, Randy and Belinda Baskins, the Barons, Drew Truelove, the Sumas, Randy and Imelda Morley, Mac and Margaret Hicks, Susie Hakey. Any updates, changes? Okay. At home, Sean Elliott, Randy Payne, Harold Porteous, Daisy Grindstaff, Lanny Carden, Kim Miller, Travis Oliver, Tommy Brown, Ann Richenberg, Bernadette Andrews, Jean Blevins, Dallas and Alice Barker, Betty McNeil, Debbie Edwards, Ruby Odom, Charles Carden, Kenneth Bristol, Emery Fryer, Kenny Williams, Rita Price, Mitzi Baker, Carl Lee Hazelwood, Casey Smith, Joanne Gwynn, Retha Williams, Jean Carroll, Jean and Craig Schaefer. Any updates?
I talked to Carl Lee. He said he was doing really good there, and he's still sick. We need to add Regan's McLean. He tested positive for RSV today.
How old is he?
He's 18 months.
18 months.
They said his lungs was clear though, but he's still tested.
That age group does pretty well.
And then also Adam and Beth, they both had the stomach virus, and they've been out of school for 3 days now, so they really had that rough.
So they've not been running you back and forth, have they? Oh, okay. I was going to suggest that y'all stay as far away from that bunch as you could. Yeah, drop it off the door and run.
They brought Paisley to Teresa on Sunday night, and she didn't go home until today. But she's been trying to keep her away
Yeah.
from that.
Yeah, if you can, that's best. Okay. And sympathies, Ida Hinkle family. Any additions on the sympathy list?
Oh, that's right, that's Sal. I won't have to say his last name. It's Kakamo or something. He was the SRO at Hampton High School, and the kids just loved him. Deputy from the sheriff's department, and he died today.
Okay. Praises and Thanksgiving. I'm just happy to be here tonight and upright. I left Mona on the couch. All right. And of course, if we need any folks to call on to share the gospel. Yeah, like I said, I'm just glad to see you folks, everybody out here tonight. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about Josephus. My wife said, "Why do you think he's so important?" I said, "It's not me. I'm not in charge of that. He's considered one of the most important historians of the first century. He was born in roughly 37 AD, which was 4 years after Christ's crucifixion, but he's an important person. I think I mentioned this before. His Roman name is Josephus, and it's Flavius Josephus. Now, in the Romans, sometimes the last name is first, and the first name is last. So he took Flavius as recognizing his benefactors, which is the Flavian emperors, which were the two of the major emperors during that time in Rome, and this is Titus is one of them, Vespasian was another, and these were his benefactors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when we get there. And his Jewish name, he was a Jewish Pharisee and a Jewish general. Was Yosef ben Mattathiah. He was a general and a priest and a Pharisee. He wrote 20 books of Jewish antiquity, 7 books about the Jewish war, and 2 books in defense of Judaism. And a lot of his book is kind of a defense of himself. Some of his most important work is actually the Jewish war, because he was there. He was a Jewish general. And we'll go through a few things tonight and talk about that. But what I wanted to do is pick some verses out of the Bible. And the reason he's looked at pretty popular, because he mentions Jesus, he mentions John the Baptist, he mentions James, his brother, or Jesus, his brother. But he was recorded and written and repeatedly and recorded again, and his works were saved through the Middle Ages. And remember, Rome was in control for hundreds of years, and then when the barbarians, and the barbarian is a term that means somebody's different from us, came from Europe and basically destroyed the Roman Empire, a lot of this information was lost. A lot of the educational things were lost. But his information was copied down by the monks who survived during that period of time. And so a lot of his materials were carried down because he was so important about writing the first century of Christianity. And he's very, very important about writing about the Jewish state. And as a result, they've used a lot of his writings to do a lot of archaeological studies, and which go along with the Bible, and found a lot of these places in the Holy Land where he talks about these places, Jericho, Masada, all these things. And I'm going to read some stuff in a little while about Jerusalem. He actually wrote down and made diagrams about the city of Jerusalem and the temple that Herod built. See, all that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, 70, 73 AD, depending on which expert you read. But anyway, he was there at that time. And so his information that he wrote down about the destruction of Jerusalem is really important, because they've used that to do archaeological digs to find these places, and they're there. And that's 2,000 years ago. And that's how accurate his writings are. So his writings are kind of important because of that fact, that they are that accurate. And so when we look back, and it supports a lot of the biblical parts. And I'm going to read a couple of verses here out of the Bible. I'm going to Luke, and Luke chapter 19, and we're going to start with verse 41. And as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. That's Jesus' prophetic words about Jerusalem. And then, let's see if I find my other place here. Keep losing my place. Here we go. Chapter 21, verse 20. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. how dreadful it will be to be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Pretty scary predictions. Pretty scary circumstances. And some people, well, this is talking about the end of time. This is talking about, symbolism is kind of, well, in reality, this all happened when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot more to the story than just this. This sounds terrible, and it is terrible, and it comes to pass. And Josephus wrote about this, and he described these things that occurred. He didn't know Jesus said this. He certainly wasn't aware of these writings at this time, because Luke wrote this later. This was after the fall of Jerusalem that this was written, that these are the words of Jesus that Luke wrote down in that first century, but at a separate point than when Josephus was writing it down. But Josephus was there and saw these things and talked about these things. So I'm going to jump around here just a little bit, back and forth, so that you can get an idea of what he's talking about. Josephus was a Jewish general. He writes about himself quite a bit in this thing, and he was a leader and a general in the area of Galilee. And that's where the Romans first started their battles. There's a whole lot of terrible things happen around this time between roughly 40 A.D. and 73 A.D., right in that area. And in that part of the world, there's a lot of horrible things happen. There was a lot of turmoil inside of the Jewish area, inside of Judea, inside of Israel, and inside of Jerusalem. If you'll remember, Jesus at this time has said, when he was doing his missionary work, his things he were talking about, and even when Paul was doing his missionary work, there was a lot of problems inside the Jewish kingdom itself. You had the Zealots, and the Zealots were totally against anything that Rome had to say. Although Rome had been pretty nice to the Jews. Some of the original dictators, the original leaders, had set aside the Jewish religion as acceptable in the Roman Empire, where they only didn't accept any others. That was later a problem for Christians, but they allowed them to worship their own God. They allowed them to have the temple separate. They allowed them to have their own leaders in the temple. They allowed them to do their own sacrifices. They had a lot of trouble with the Jews when they tried to go to emperor worship, because the Jews wouldn't do it. As a matter of fact, Pilate had put statues of the emperor into the temple, had a big to-do about that, had to pull them out. There was a huge upheaval in Alexandria, over in Egypt, such that the Jews rioted. What happened there was, though, the Egyptians put them down and killed a lot of them. And then in different places remember, Israel's the northern kingdom, Judea is the southern kingdom. And basically, the Galilee is in the Israel part of the kingdom, Samaria. The Samaritans, not Samaria, but the Samaritans. And so there was a lot of back and forth between the people in the Jewish community themselves, the other people who lived in the area, and the Zealots. So there's a lot of things going on. At one time, Josephus led an army of 100,000 men in the Galilee area. He was a pretty important general, and he worked in that area quite a bit and put together his army. But it's interesting what he said about the Romans, though. He knew they didn't have enough guys, because he talked about dealing with the Romans, and he wrote that when he wrote this history, he got to remember now the Romans hired him to write this. He talked about how the Romans kept their armies together all the time, whereas the Jews just gathered people up and they tried to train and fight. They weren't trained fighters. even though they were aggressive, sometimes it didn't work because, again, they weren't doing things under God. If you remember in the old Bible, and he talks about that in Antiquities a lot of times. So he was over the city of Jopatha. Now, Jopatha was a city in Galilee that was pretty well protected, and they had an army of around 80,000 Jews in that city. And then Vespasian, who was later become the Roman emperor, brought his troops. He had 20,000 troops and 2,000 cavalry came and laid siege to the city. And they fought there for quite some time, but they weren't able to get into the city very well until they built a ramp up into the city. And then the guards went to sleep and they attacked, and they killed 40,000 Jews in that city in a fight. And Josephus was their leader. And they thought they killed him because they were burning everything down. They actually killed everybody in the city and burned it to ashes. The Romans did. But he and a group of people got away and went into actually a well and survived there for a while. But then the Romans gave them an opportunity to give up. And he wanted to give up. He wanted to surrender. But the other people in the well didn't want to surrender. So what happened? Well, let's see. Let me get my other pages here together. He gave in. And I'm going to tell you the story about how they captured him. And he wrote this down. Now, this is his writing. So you can assume that this may be embellished a little bit to make himself look good. This is written in one of his books. It's titled The Capture of Josephus. Now, he writes this like he's a third person standing out here and talking about this, although it's him. Okay? The Romans instituted a search for the body of Josephus, but during the massacre he had slipped away into a deep pit, in the side of which a large cavern invisible from above. Here he found 40 distinguished people in hiding, with considerable provisions. During the day he lay hidden, but at night he attempted to escape from the city. Since every exit was closely guarded, however, he had to return to the cavern. For 2 days he escaped detection, but on the third, a woman who had been in the cave was captured and betrayed the secret. Vespasian at once sent 2 tribunes with orders to offer Josephus protection and induce him to come up. They failed to persuade him, and Vespasian sent another tribune, Nicanor, who was a friend of Josephus. Nicanor assured Josephus that because of his valor, he was rather an object of admiration than of hatred to the commanders. Vespasian, he said, would never have sent a friend for the purpose of deceiving him and wanted to save a brave man. While Josephus was hesitating, the Roman troops in their rage tried to throw fire into the cavern. But their commander, anxious to take the Jewish general alive, restrained them. Josephus suddenly recalled those nightly dreams in which God had foretold to him the fate of the Jews and the destinies of the Romans. He now silently prayed, "Since you have chosen me to announce what is to come, if I will consent to live, that I call you to witness that I go not as a traitor, but as your servant." But when he was about to surrender, the Jews in the cavern pointed their swords at him and threatened to kill him as a traitor if he submitted. Josephus tried to persuade them that this was right to save one's own life when it could be done without dishonor, and it was a great sin to throw it away unless in open warfare against an enemy. But they ran at him from all sides, and with their blades at his throat, he finally warded them off with his general's authority. "If we must die," he then said, "let it not be by our own, but by each other's hands. Let us draw lots, and the one who draws the first lot will be killed by him who draws the second," and so on through our entire number so that no one escapes. Okay? So a suicide pact. They readily agreed, and he drew lots with the rest. Each one in turn bared his throat to the next, until, should one say by fortune or by the providence of God, Josephus and one other remained alone. Josephus persuaded this man to surrender along with himself to Nicanor, who brought him before Vespasian. The Romans crowded around him on all sides. Those at a distance shouted that he should be killed, but those near him thought of his exploits and pitied him. Titus in particular was struck by Josephus' nobility and misfortune, and Titus' intercession with his father was the main reason the prisoner was spared. Now that Vespasian is his father, Titus is the younger guy. Vespasian is the general, he's the younger general. And they later become Caesar 1 and Caesar 2. Okay. Vespasian ordered that he be closely guarded, however, intending to send him to Nero. That's not a good choice. Josephus asked for a private interview with Vespasian, and all withdrew except Titus and 2 of his friends. You think, Vespasian, said Josephus, that you have a mere captive in Josephus, but I come to you as a messenger of a greater destiny. Why send me to Nero? Do you think he will continue in office? You, Vespasian, will be Caesar and emperor. You and your son are here, for you are master not only of me, but of sea and land and of the whole human race. Buttering up a little bit, huh? Vespasian at first discounted this declaration of Josephus as flattery, but gradually became to believe it. One of the friends of Titus who was present expressed his surprise that Josephus had been unable to predict either the fall of Jupiter or his own captivity, but Josephus replied that he had predicted both these things. Vespasian privately questioned the prisoners regarding these statements, and finding them true, began to believe that Josephus really was a prophet. Although he kept him in chains, he presented him with clothes and other articles and treated him with kindness. How about that? More or less a more modern day Daniel. Okay? So even though he led battle against the Romans in a big deal, they respected bravery. And then I don't know if it was providence or sneakiness, but anyway, everybody died but him and this other guy, and he got out of it. So he was. So that's how he ended up being basically a slave to the Romans, but not necessarily a slave, because as time went on, he was protected by those 2 guys who were emperors, and he was able to write all these things down about all this stuff that happened, so that we might see it. And he was telling them that God had told him that this is what was going to happen, that the Romans were going to destroy all these things and to export the Jews all over the world, which is what they did. So I find that kind of remarkable that here's this statement that he's making that is a reflection of what Jesus was prophesying at a separate time in a different place. So this is in Josephus' own words. So God does things perhaps in different ways that we don't quite understand. And so the Jewish war continued actually to about AD 77, which is when Masada was destroyed. That was the last Jewish stronghold. And so that was the Vespasian and Titus were the ones that did all the winning. They were the ones that ended up being the leaders. Now I'm going to jump around here a little bit more to read you a few things, other things that are kind of important. Okay, now they're surrounding Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now surrounded. Now Jerusalem is a giant city. It's a fortress on a hill, and it has water that comes into it through a carved out tunnel underneath the city that goes up into the palaces. And that's where they have their water coming into them. They have these huge 30-foot thick walls. It's a huge place. And it's set full of battlements. And Josephus goes into the materials and things that they used to knock the walls down, and all the battering rams and the catapults and all that kind of stuff. And as a matter of fact, modern day folks have taken that information and built these things. And they actually work. And they're incredible siege machines. And that's what the Romans were using. They took this information. Well, Titus doesn't want to actually destroy the whole city. He wants to take it. And because it's huge, it's magnificent, he wants to take it and be in control of it. Now, he's got all these Roman soldiers. He's got actually three different armies there. He's got Agrippa's army, he's got Titus's army, and he's got his army. Now, these are all made up of numerous legions, thousands and thousands of Roman soldiers. And Roman soldiers don't work for free, okay? They work for a pittance about food and their clothing and their fed. But when they defeat an enemy of any kind, they receive the spoils of war. And the Jews have been used, and I don't have time to go through it here, have been used in a whole variety of different ways to attack the Roman soldiers, traps, all kinds of horrible things that they fell into, fires, pitch on fire, things like that. So this was a bloody, nasty, deadly thing, and it was so bad in the city that, trying to live through the thing was horrible. And so it's one of those things where you just, how can people live this? How can people live through these things? And a lot of this stuff comes to pass. So I'm going to talk about one part. Now, this takes a long time. This doesn't happen overnight. These sieges last sometimes actually for years. So they don't, we when we read it and we think about this, it's a story you talk about, within a few days. That's not how it works. Sometimes it may a year longer. Titus suspended the siege for a few days to see if the loss of the second wall or famine might induce any to surrender. He used the time to review his troops and pay them their salaries. They appeared as a gleaming parade of shining arms which filled the throngs of Jewish observers with awe and dismay. In 4 days, the Roman legions had all received their pay. On the 5th, since the Jews had not requested peace, Titus started raising embankments both at the Antonia and at the John's Monument in order to capture the temple and the upper city. Now, these embankments are the ramps that they build, the dirt ramps and rocks and stuff that they do. Now, the Roman soldiers don't all do it themselves. They usually have slaves that do that, which are the conquered people they caught. Okay. Let's see. Simon and his troops impeded those that worked beside the monument by raids, while John and the zealots obstructed those at the Antonia. With daily practice, the Jews had now become skilled in the art of artillery engines, and their 300 quick fires and 40 stone throwing seriously retarded the Roman earthworks. Can you imagine that? How much is going on? They're building these things and they're having rocks thrown at them and flames and stuff. Titus, anxious to preserve the city from destruction, sent Josephus to negotiate with the Jews in their native tongue. Josephus therefore went around the wall, keeping out of range of projectiles and yet within earshot, and implored the people to spare themselves, their country, and their temple. Their forefathers, men far superior to them, had yielded because they knew God was on Rome's side, and it was now hopeless to fight famine and the imminent conquest. During this part here, Josephus added pages after pages of lessons his forebears should have learned from history, and then concludes with a final appeal. So he's talking about, remember when Nebuchadnezzar came and invaded Jerusalem and carried everybody? He's talking about that. This is part of the Jewish history, so he's explaining to them, and God had punished them before. God's doing it again. Now, I think somebody mentioned that a little over there in Luke a while ago, that what was going to happen, they were being punished for this. And so he's talking about this, even though he's not saying Christ said this. He's talking about what happened in the past and what God is doing to him again. He's bringing this prophecy to truth. Okay? During his address, many on the ramparts derided and cursed Josephus, while others threw missiles at him, and they did not yield to his cheerful appeal. The people, however, decided to desert. They would swallow gold coins to elude the rebels, and after escaping to the Romans, they had ample supplies after discharging their vows. Titus released most of them, which further encouraged desertion. But the partisans of John and Simon kept a sharp lookout for such refugees and slaughtered any suspects. Sounds pretty vicious, doesn't it? Here, some of the regular citizens are saying, I believe what he says. I don't want to live through this stuff, so I'll surrender. So they swallowed their gold coins. But they got caught. They were slaughtered. So you have the rebels again. You have this group of people, and then it's the zealots who are fighting against the Romans. And they're holding the city. And in turn, they're still wanting to fight to the last person. Now, it says it in other places. They were actually taking the food and materials from the citizenry and feeding themselves and the soldiers, so the citizenry was starving to death. And what was it? Woe unto the pregnant ladies and to the breastfeeding mothers, okay? Taking things from them to keep their soldiers ready to fight. And of course, they're throwing stuff all the time and fighting all the time. So it's a horrible time. And Josephus is trying to convince them that God says you're being punished. Give in. And they don't want to. These are the zealots again. Let's see. Let me find another couple of places here. It's been kind of. Now these are the words of Josephus. This is one of those things that works. Here we go. This is a description of the horrors in Jerusalem. This is what's going on. Famine now raged in the city, and the rebels took all the food they could find in a house-to-house search. While the poor starved to death by the thousands, people gave all their wealth for a little measure of wheat and hid to eat it hastily and in secret so it would not be taken from them. Wives would snatch the food from their husbands, children from fathers, and mothers from the very mouths of infants. Many of the rich were put to death by Simon and John, while the sufferings of the people were so fearful that they can hardly be told. And no other city ever endured such miseries. Not since the world began was there ever a generation more prolific in crime than this bastard scum of the nation who destroyed the city. Okay? Now we remember something like that in the old Bible when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem before because they didn't follow his rules. And here they're doing it again. History repeats itself. And that's what was going on. It was that bad. And Jesus predicted all this. He said this would happen. He predicted this. So, of course, Josephus didn't know that. And let's see. Now, it's what kind of makes this fun is these are the words of Josephus as they've been in, this was written in, most of it was written in Greek and was copied down in Greek over time. And then this is in English, of course. It's been separated out and we can understand it better. And let's see. Okay. While the temple was in flames, the victors stole everything they could lay their hands on. Now, these are the Romans. And slaughtered all who were caught. No pity was shown to age or rank, old men or children, the laity or priest. All were massacred. As the flames roared up, and since the temple stood on a hill, it seemed as if the whole city were ablaze. The noise was deafening with war cries of the legions, howls of the rebels surrounded by fire and sword, and the shrieks of the people. The ground was hidden by corpses, and the soldiers had to climb over heaps of bodies in pursuit of the fugitives. The Jewish brigands forced their way through the Romans into the outer court of the temple and into the city. Some of the priests at first tore up spikes from the sanctuary and hurled them at the Romans, but afterwards, retreating from the flames, they withdrew to the wall. Can you imagine what that must be like? What that terrible, terrible situation was like? How those things occurred? What was happening there at that time? And so they burned it all down, and the temple, the Roman soldiers were just, at this point, of course, this siege had been going on for a while, and they'd lost friends and those circumstances. So they've been, the zealots and then the rebels had fought back, and there was just, the carnage was just incredible. It's just hard to believe the carnage. So Titus actually was trying to stop his soldiers from burning the temple. He did not want the temple to burn, actually. He was trying to prevent the temple from burning. But there was such an outrage. And then when the zealots started attack from the temple into the Roman soldiers who were waiting, standing there, that was it. That was the end of it. So once they saw that, the Roman soldiers said, okay, this is it. And so they go in and they burn it. They burn everything down, and it's so burned so badly that they thought there's a lot more gold inside the temple than there were. If you remember the way the temple's made, it's made of cedar inside with gold lining on the walls. And they burned it down, and all that melted down into the rocks, into the boulders, and the way the thing was built in the walls. They turned the boulders over to look for pieces of gold that they found. So they destroyed the temple utterly down to the bottom row of boulders. That bad. They destroyed it that much. That whole temple was destroyed. And of course that was talked about, that no stone would be left on the others. And Jesus talked about that. So when you hear the actual wording, now you got to remember now, Josephus is a Roman historian. He's a Jew, but he's telling it from the Roman aspect of it. And this history was actually read by Vespasian and Titus after he wrote all this stuff, and they okayed it. So he had to be, writing to please them too. So he wrote this stuff to please them, so it was accurate to the Romans' point of view. Now, I imagine if you asked some of the Jewish people, they weren't too thrilled about this, who were being killed this way. But it sounds like the regular folks there that were involved, that weren't the rebels, were just people that lived there, suffered mightily and were slaughtered, literally slaughtered. And several times, and I didn't go over it, and when they were fighting up in Galilee, there was a huge battle at Capernaum, huge battle there. And it was started by the Jews against the Romans in Capernaum. And then the Romans came in and killed everybody. 60,000 people were slaughtered in that one city. And they left a garrison of Roman soldiers there to keep it from building back up by the Jews. They killed every single Jewish person in that town. 60,000 people were slaughtered. And that was not the only place. Different places throughout Galilee, whenever the Romans came in and they stood against them, they killed them all. Massacred them all. Men, women, children, everybody. So when the Romans came and took charge, and they had an opportunity in Jerusalem to surrender. I don't know what they would have done with the rebels. They probably killed them regardless. But the population may have survived. And Titus did try to save the temple. He was going to save the temple. That was his plan. Because Josephus had tried to talk them into saving. He was a Pharisee. And he tried to talk them into saving it. But they couldn't. So, I'm done a little bit early. So, when you read the Bible, when you look at this, and you go back and you read Daniel, you read Isaiah, you read any of the prophets, and they talk about the destruction of Jerusalem the first time with Nebuchadnezzar. This is like a repeat. And the way we know about the description this time is from other sources. Besides, the Bible talks about it, but not like this. Talks about, and it's because, again, they did not recognize the word of the Lord. Yeah, you got to remember that. And so they were headstrong people. They were the chosen of God, and they worshiped God the way they wanted to, but they didn't do it the right way. They didn't follow it, and so God destroyed them. So when you look at it from this direction and read these verses, now there's Matthew and Mark both have sections on this, on Jesus' prophecy. So if you want to take time and pull those places out, I've got them written down if you want. But the best description, these two things are in Luke, these two best descriptions of what Jesus has said. And so this came to pass. Now, what's that got to do with today? Well, are we a whole lot different than the people back then? Greed, anger, improper worship, not giving the power to God, not recognizing Him, not doing the right thing. And so the world has changed very little in this period of time in terms of people. It's just now we can do it with a whole lot less, a whole lot more damage with bigger bombs, I guess. But any questions about that? I hope I wasn't too bloodthirsty there, but I wanted to read you what was really going on, and this is out of the horse's mouth, basically. But I think most people don't realize that Josephus was a Pharisee and a general in the Jewish army before the Romans, took him and changed his situation. But he thought he was protected by God, and it looks like he may have been to pass this information on. I just think that was interesting. 40 of them are in the cavern, and everybody ends up dead but him and one guy. Excuse me. He was pretty bright. Any comments? That's a whole different world. All right. That finishes Josephus for us. Is there any other particular subject? Anything? I do occasional Wednesday nights. Is there any burning subject that you just want to hear more about that we can do some research on and talk about? Is there something that just sticks out in your mind that you'd like to hear about, or something we could dive into? I didn't get a whole lot into the first century church, except you need to realize that while this is happening during this time, the church is growing. As a matter of fact, the Romans left Antioch intact and marched from Antioch into Galilee. Did not damage Antioch. And Antioch is where most people think the first actual Christian missionaries came from throughout the rest of the Mediterranean. That's where they really put a lot of effort into missionary work coming out of Antioch. And so that's an important, so that's what's going, there's other stuff going on at the time that this horrible stuff is going on. And the way the worship of Christ is growing at this time. In spite of what's going on here in Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem is destroyed. But the idea was to put people over the rest of the world, send them out. And of course, when we read the Bible and talk about Paul, during that time between AD 33, AD 34, and AD 60, 65, the church is growing like crazy through other places. It's not staying in Jerusalem. Paul being I guess probably the most important missionary figure to us, to the Gentiles, throughout the rest of the world. Otherwise, they would have kept that. Remember, Peter wanted to keep it in Jerusalem, wanted to keep the church in Jerusalem, and wanted to keep it just with the Jews. And Paul says, no, that's not what Jesus has told us. And then everybody's gone out. James, of course, is, just before this, is killed, before this happens, who is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So the church in Jerusalem is being punished by the Jews. Is who's doing this at this time, not the Romans in Jerusalem at this point. And so they're being pushed out. And so the missionary work is being pushed out throughout the rest of the Mediterranean up into Asia Minor. But Antioch is left alone. Antioch is not destroyed. And Antioch is an important missionary center. Paul spent time there. Remember, that's where they came back to. Barnabas was from Antioch. And that's where they came from. So that first 30 years between the time that Jesus was crucified and roughly 68 AD is when a lot of this stuff started happening. Between 68 and 77 is when all the horrible things happened in Judea. The whole time, this Christian development and growth is going out through the rest of the Roman Empire. Remember, Paul is in Rome roughly 60 AD while this is going on. And Nero is the Caesar while this is happening, where Vespasian and Titus, who are going to be the later dictators, are in Jerusalem, destroying Jerusalem. Paul is in Rome. Okay? That's where he is. So there's a reason God allowed this. His people knew him not. But the rest of them moved out through the rest of the world. So this is not something that happens in a bubble. When you think about what's going on in the rest of the world at that time, when we read the letters that Paul wrote to Titus, and our Titus, not the emperor, but to Timothy and to the different places he went, this is all happening just prior to all this is going to occur. And then Rome, of course, controls that entire world then for the next several hundred years. And so you could travel all throughout the Roman Empire until the time of Constantine, who makes Christianity the religion of Rome later. And that's a whole nother story. Okay. All right. Any other comments? I hope I didn't bore you too bad. Okay. All right. Greg, would you dismiss us, please?